Recently, Nina Teicholz did a paper on how carnivores are actually women too. If you have not read the article, it is such a fantastic piece that explains why meat is possibly considered masculine and who really is behind the carnivore diet, especially a lot of women. In this conversation, we also talk about saturated fats and seed oils. We hear so much about what is so bad about vegetable oils and seed oils, and we talk a lot about the details. Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho, and I'm board certified in holistic nutrition. And I have a private practice where we focus on root cause healing, and that often starts with the Carnivore Cures all meat elimination diet. Today, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Nina Teicholz. We talk about her recent article about carnivore diet for women and the importance of why we should be represented. And then we talk a lot about heart disease, saturated fats, seed oils, vegetable oils, and we talk about all the nuances about even how to change dietary guidelines and why the dietary guidelines, even if we don't follow the My Food Plate guidelines, still matters to us, whether it's impacting us from a school perspective or in the hospitals or in mandates. It still affects us even with the dollar. In this conversation, Nina shares why all of those nuances matter, why it matters that we are in our best health, and how we can support changes in the dietary guideline, nutritional guidelines, and how we should support our health and wellness in the long term. Let's get right into the interview. Hi, Nina. It's so awesome to interview with you again. I think the last interview was during the Carnivore Summit, but for the people that may not have heard of you, if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, well, I'm a journalist and I got into this field because I spent almost a decade researching this book, which came out in 2014 and is still, I think, a book that a lot of people cite is really important to them, which I'm really happy to hear about. And it's the central arguments in it. Well, it really tells the story of how we got to these dietary recommendations that pretty much everybody believes, like, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats. And it tells a story really more comprehensively than anywhere else, even if you know the story already, but of Ansel Keys and his work and how his work went to Washington and how that became our dietary guidelines. And it's really like an amazing story, I think, still for many people. So it's sort of the foundation, part of the foundation of this movement that has now sprung about, low carb, paleo, carnivore. And after that book came out, then I almost right after that, I founded a group called the Nutrition Coalition, which is a nonprofit dedicated to trying to make our dietary guidelines more rigorous and based on good science, which they clearly are not. And I did that just realizing how important these guidelines are, and something maybe Judy and I will talk about. But so we've done a lot of work over the years, and now I'm really returning to journalism. So I've done over the past year, I have a column on a platform called Substack that I write with Gary Taubes, another journalist, and we are just trying to do what should be in nutrition journalism everywhere, which is bringing kind of an investigative, critical mind to the science, the politics, the finances, and funding behind some of these dietary recommendations. So just trying to kind of like pull back the curtain on what our food and nutrition landscape look like. So yeah, I've been in this field now for over a decade and been involved in a lot of different ways.
Your book, when I first got started into nutrition, was the book that everyone told me to read. And then when I read it, I mean, you have so many studies in there, and you do truly share the story and the history of how we even got to believe that saturated fat is bad. And to this day, your book is cited all the time for the studies or the importance of what book should I start with first. And then to have you and Gary now work together on this column in Substack, and I'll put that in the show notes. It's amazing. So first of all, thank you
Good to
so
hear.
much for both of you getting together and writing those pieces. So recently, you interviewed with me and just talked a little bit about this carnivore article that you were trying to write. Out of curiosity, what made you want to even write that article?
I'm very grateful because it put me in touch with you, Judy, that I did this article and really looked gave me an opportunity to look into more into the carnivore movement, which was really interesting for me. I was inspired to write this article because there was a headline in the New York Times last month which said, "Meet the men who eat only meat," or only in parentheses. But and this had just come after reading articles, so many articles about the right-wing men who eat meat, the right-wing toxic masculine men who are eating only meat on this diet, and how they're all like MAGA supporters. And I mean, I just was so frustrated with the coverage of carnivore. There wasn't any attempt to even be serious about the science of it or try to understand what the health issues were, what brought people to carnivore. And it made me so upset to see how mean-spirited these articles were towards people who had nearly died or suffered horrible health problems, somebody like Michaela Peterson. And they're just so nasty and heartless. So I just thought somebody has to tell the real story of like who's in the carnivore movement, which at the time I really wasn't fully aware of the number of women who are in this movement, but I was very happy to find out, and I'm happy to tell you more about what I found.
Yeah, please share. And as we were talking, talking about the different genders, and I realized, yes, it is, at least in our practice, it's we do have males too, but there's a large proportion that is females. And I think over the age of 50, there's obviously women that are younger too, but a bulk of the people are not doing carnivore because they just want to be cool or on this trend. They're doing it because they're really sick and they just, standard care has not supported them. So what have you found in, I think you interviewed many different carnivore women, but what were some of the things that you found about the carnivore movement?
So, first of all, I found in talking to Sean Baker and Paul Saladino, who
Mhm.
are well known in this field and have definitely have the most followers and both have books on carnivore. They said 40% of their practices are women. And which is amazing to me because I don't see from their sort of marketing that they're not aimed at women
Right.
really, in my view, the way that they present themselves, but clearly women need this. And then of course there's your practice, and then I put out a call on Twitter saying, hello carnivore women, you women out there, and I had hundreds of responses. So I was, what I learned was that there's a lot of very sick women out there who are main, as I think I got this from you, for, over 40, most of them. They're came to carnivore not because they're trying to like look good in a muscle t-shirt, but because they're really, really sick. And the list of health conditions is incredible what people are dealing with. I mean, autoimmune conditions, skin conditions, all kinds of like connectivity, like bone joint pain, all it's just a huge long list. IBS issues. So I list all these conditions, and I list all of the conditions that people who had responded to my Twitter call said they had resolved, like in some cases very quickly on carnivore. Things you would never think were associated with diet ever. I don't know, somebody said, vertigo has gone. I mean, things that just don't even seem related to diet. So that was a revelation to me. And then I went back to look at the origins of the carnivore movement, and it turns out that is also dominated by women. So the earliest carnivore online sort of message forum board was hosted by somebody named Charles Washington, but most of the moderators, and this is maybe in 2007, 2008, most of the moderators and the people in that group were women who were unable to lose weight on low carb and were looking to figure out how to lose weight, or in one condition there was some other conditions, health conditions they were seeking to resolve. So Kelly Hogan, she was on that, and
I,
Amber, she was one of the moderators, and there's a couple of other people. Kelly Hogan had the first carnivore pregnancy that everybody wanted to see, is it safe? Is it safe? And she had a safe and healthy pregnancy, and then went on to have three more children carnivore. So, and Amber is really, in some ways, sort of one of the intellectual founders of the movement, has done incredibly important talks and laid out some of the intellectual framing of the movement. in a talk that you can, if anybody's interested, they can get it through my Substack piece. But yeah, it was incredible to me. And so I talked a little bit about why I think that carnivore is so unfairly treated in the mainstream media, and that has to do with the, well, huge bias against meat, the belief that people who eat meat are destroying the planet, and there can be no justification for that. Like they must be lambasted and criticized for that. And it's a well-known kind of trope of the mainstream media now. Anything that they do not like is right wing. So really anything that they dislike is they try to make it right wing, or hard right, or MAGA right. And so that's why it's portrayed as a right wing phenomenon. And to be fair, it is a little right wing in the sense that it has been embraced by the right more than the left for various reasons. But the treatment on by the right wing media is just kind of hands off, where the left is really out to try to, I think, to slime and slander the carnivore movement in a way that I just felt was really unfair. So I think those are the main findings from the piece. Maybe you remember something else.
I love that you brought in the history of how meat has always been sort of masculine. And I thought that
Oh yeah.
walkthrough was really fair for the people that are against or why meat equals masculinity. But, and I think that all makes sense. But why do you think it is that? So I think the part that's hard for me to understand is why is mainstream media so against this movement? Is it because that then big food, big pharma would lose money? Or is it just because I'm against this? This goes against plant-based and liberals tend to eat more. I went to UC Berkeley, and Berkeley tends to have a lot of plant-based, and it also tends to be very liberal. So is it that? Is it just because it's an opposing view? I still am not clear. And I think you did such a great walkthrough. And I know that you don't want to say like this is a reason, but do you have any sentiments of why they're so
Yeah.
against?
I mean, there are a number of reasons, and I think some of them are more speculative than others, but some are really very clear. And, one is, let's start with the most generous interpretation that we can give, which is that there's just a lot of bias. People are biased, and they have their training, if they're doctors or the healthcare practitioners, they just have a long time bias or an intellectual kind of rigidity that's hard for them to overcome. Scientists have been devoting their entire careers to promoting plant-based diets. It's almost impossible for them to understand that maybe that everything they thought and studied and published on could be wrong. So that's one reason, just intellectual bias. Then there's the very, very strong animal rights movement, which really just does not want to see they don't want to see animals experimented on, and they don't want to see animals eaten. There's sort of a front group for them called the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, PCRM, but they're first and foremost an animal rights group, and then some of them are doctors in white coats, and so they call themselves a physicians group, but really, according to an investigation done by the Journal of the American Medical Association, an author there, that I think fewer than 18% of their members are actually physicians. So it's just an example. There's many, many people who are motivated by animal rights. Also, the funders of many of these documentaries, like somebody like James Cameron, who's done Game Changers and other documentaries. So that's another reason. A third is I think there's no question that the pharmaceutical industry they do not profit from people getting healthy. And so they're in the business of selling, of serving chronic disease, managing chronic disease. There are drugs and devices and procedures, and if you get off kidney dialysis, you are no longer a profit center for them. So you just can't be too cynical about that. And I've written about the influence of the industry, like directly the fact that they fund the American College of Cardiology, and how hostile that group is to low carb, including putting out press releases on studies that never happened. I mean, it's really quite aggressive what the pharmaceutical industry does. The food industry, same story. And we know that these industries influence our dietary policy, because I did a paper, co-authored a paper showing that the expert committee leading the dietary guidelines in the last iteration for the 2020 guidelines, which we currently have. 95% of that 20-person committee had at least one tie with a food or pharmaceutical company, and and half of them had 30 such ties or more. One member of the committee had 152 ties. I mean, these are things like sitting on a board, getting financing from, being an advisor, scientific advisor to. So there's a lot of infiltration of food and pharma in the world of nutrition, in our policy, and they fund scientific studies. Many studies are funded by industry. So yes, I think that's another motivation. And then I think that, let me just give you two more because it's a long list. Then there's the whole fake food industry, which has really sprung up in the last decade. But fake Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burger, or Impossible Meat, Beyond Meat burgers. There are companies that replace eggs, fish. There are companies that are replacing every natural food really on the planet. Bill Gates is developing fake fats. I mean, vegetable oils are also fake fats, but he's developing even more fake fats to replace animal fat. So those industries, even though we know that, say, the meat replacement industry is not being successful, I mean, it's really tanking. Those industries are still great. I mean, to blow up that bubble, like the Oatly bubble, and make your hundreds of millions, and then the industry might tank or the company might tank, but still people are making money off of that kind of profiteering, that model. And then very powerfully in the last decade, we've seen the climate change movement, which is possibly the most powerful force on the earth today, which is telling us we cannot be eating meat in order to save our planet. And in Europe, it's much more advanced than it is here, but it kind of gives you a picture of what might come to the US. I mean, they're actively shutting down farms, they're taking land away from ranchers, they're taxing, I'm not sure if they're taxing, but definitely proposing taxes on meat. And everybody has been encouraged to reduce meat, and people are cutting back on meat as a result. So, and there are still real, there are goals to have, as in cut in half the consumption of meat by 2030, and that's the UN goal for the entire planet. So, all these forces coming together are extremely powerful, and it sort of shows you that it's not just carnivore, but all of low carb, people who are low carb, who tend to eat more animal foods. I mean, it's amazing where this movement is as strong as it is, given all the forces lined up against it. But people want to be healthy, and I think that's absolutely 100% legitimate. And actually, I've heard from people who say, I'd rather save the planet, and I know that I'm suffering as a result, but I mean, I would never make that choice, and I certainly would never impose that choice on anyone else. But I mean, it's an individual choice that people can make. I would rather just not take an extra cross-country trip or cancel my vacation in Bali, which I don't have. But I mean, to me, that's a better choice.
Right. And I think the medical industry as a whole has a bigger carbon footprint than even meat does. So I think there's all these nuances that they don't share. They even talk about how cows take so much water, but it's actually the recycled water, or a lot of their
Right.
urine or the rainwater. And they don't talk about how, well, cotton and I think it was teas that use more of the blue, the clean water. So there's all these nuances that they just hate to share. But, just from all the research that you've done, whether it's talking to the carnivores, whether writing the Big Fat Surprise, and then doing your journalism, and then being part of or creating Nutrition Coalition, it seems like it's never going to be a battle we can win. But what have you seen from all your journalism of, there are movements still like the carnivore diet that we can still find health amidst all of the stuff that's against us?
So I guess a couple of answers to that. One is that the work that I did in the Nutrition Coalition is resulting in change that I can't talk about yet. So some of that work, trying to mobilize Congress on this issue, which we didn't do super publicly because some of this stuff just has to happen more quietly. But that I think we may be able to produce some meaningful change at the national level. And then beyond that, I think sometimes I feel very pessimistic about sort of the state of even like the freedom of the press, like our ability to have our ideas be heard, to access larger audiences. For those of us who are journalists and who are writing, all I can say is, Gary and I started our newsletter. Well, I started it a little over a year ago, and we already have almost 45,000 subscribers, which maybe, it's not like Ken Berry's 3 million people, but I mean, a lot of our subscribers are academics and policymakers. And so I know that we're reaching some of the right ears. And then beyond that, I think that it is going to need like a lot of bottom up change. And that happens, I mean, through your listeners and your readers and everybody following you. Most importantly, people need to fix their own health and learn how to do that, which can be hard. And then you have to help your family and your loved ones, and then move out to your community beyond that. And then I do think there's going to be some level of mobilization needed. So I was never in the business of like mobilizing a movement of people, but I think there are efforts currently being organized. I know Ken Berry wants to start something called the American Diabetes Society as opposed to the established American Diabetes Association,
Right.
which would kind of be a patient advocacy group. And I think that would be fantastic. I had always envisioned like a million person metabolically wounded march on Washington. So, people taking like holding alongside their like before pictures, like just like marching on Washington. I think eventually something like that is just going to have to happen. But making yourself strong first. I mean, one of the things that when our health is taken from us and when we have brain fog and we're don't feel well and we can't get out of bed and we don't have energy, like it's actually robbing us of our vitality and humanity and who we are can be as humans. And that is, so we first need to restore to ourselves that kind of vitality that allows us to be fully citizens of our country. We need to have the energy to fight if that's, if people choose to take on that.
Right.
They need to be well first.
Right. I think when I was talking to you, I was telling you that we've probably worked with over 2,000 carnivore clients and patients, and everyone is really sick in some form or fashion. And whether it's that the carnivore diet isn't moving the needle enough, so they maybe have to look at other things. But most of these people are not doing it for biohacking reasons. It's because they're sick. And like we said, standard care isn't working enough, maybe some medication, some autoimmune diagnosis, even with a label, it's not fixing them to have that vibrant health. Then they try carnivore. And I don't know a single person that doesn't heal something. Maybe it's not everything, but they don't heal something by eating a carnivore diet that reduces inflammation. And then when they have that ability to feel better and not be in bed or stuck in bed or have histamines or every other illness that makes them have to be in bed and not be able to be their full selves, then they can even think about, well, can I help my neighbor? Can I help my family? Can I help my children? Can I be the person that I'm meant to be? And that's why people want to do a carnivore diet, because they want their life back. They want to
Yeah.
be able to feel normal when every single one of us should have that right. And I think that's where carnivore with all these hip pieces it's so sensationalized in the wrong way. And so I mean, I don't talk about it much, but we have our kids' school has a lot of functional doctors and they're so against carnivore. So I always say, unless you try it, I don't really care to hear what you have to say, because unless you try it and know that it can do wonders, it's really such a moot point to say, well, the studies show. Well, of course, no one is going to do a study on carnivore diet versus a plant-based or a standard American diet to show healing other than that Harvard poll. But we need to do more things like that. But it's really hard when the Mediterranean diet and all the studies that you were able to find that show and all the demonizations, even if we misconstrue the results, there's so much support for the other side that says, yes, a carnivore diet is going to cause you heart disease and such. And so it's really unfortunate.
Well, we all live in an environment where, I mean, I don't, like propaganda might be too strong a word, but we have lived in a media environment where we're constantly barraged with these messages, plant-based is best, Mediterranean diet for this, that, and the other thing, and low carb is bad for you, and beware of that diet. And so, I mean, I don't blame people for being misinformed because that's our media environment, and we all were those people. So we just happen to like really kind of get, see through the looking glass, step to the other side and understand. I mean, many people change their diet. They don't even understand how, why it is that these misinformed articles are still coming out. I mean, I've been studying the politics and the conflicts of interest in this so long. I think I have a pretty clear picture of why this is all happening. But I don't blame people for being misinformed. I mean, even doctors are misinformed. Everybody's misinformed. So, and they don't even realize the extent to which they're biased. But I do want to say, when you say there's no experiments on carnivore, remember there is that 1 year experiment
Right.
on
Stephenson.
Stephenson, yeah, back in 1928, where partially he and a colleague they spent part of it in a New York hospital, but there were like 10 publications that came out of that where they measured everything they knew how to measure in 1928 or 29, and they were in perfect health. So that's a very tiny experiment. But you're right, there's no clinical trial on carnivore, and it probably would not even get ethical board approval to conduct such a trial. And meanwhile, the vegan diet, which is known to be nutritionally insufficient in
Right.
major dangerous ways, is continually studied, and that shows harm. You like the latest study by Christopher Gardner at Stanford, who is vegan, and his entire center is underwritten by Beyond Meat. He did a study on the vegan diet, and in 8 weeks, people's B12 stores plummeted by like 73%.
Wow.
That is dangerous.
Right.
So that should have been headlines all over the world, really. A vegan diet endangers your health, seriously endangers your health, but that's not the environment that we live in. So, yeah, all I can say is, I'm sympathetic to people who are misinformed. I'm really far less sympathetic with somebody like Christopher Gardner or some of these nutrition experts who truly know better. They know the studies. And we can talk about Christopher Gardner. I mean, his first study that he ever did was a comparison of four diets where the low carb diet outperformed every other diet. That was his very first study. It was the largest and longest study he did. And after that, he stopped testing the low carb diet because it would outperform what he wanted to be successful, which is the vegan diet that he was ideologically attached to. Anyway, I'm much less patient with the nutrition experts because they should know the literature, and they all know who I am. I'm pretty sure of that by now. And they don't like me, obviously, but I mean, they should know better. And they're perpetuating incorrect, non-evidence-based ideas, either based on their own biases or their own ideological beliefs. And I feel like that's not acceptable when people are suffering so much. It's not acceptable in any case.
Right. I watched an interview recently from Gregor, who's one of the plant-based leaders, and he
Yeah.
said something like his argument for B12 was B12 is actually from the microorganisms from the soil. And even if you eat meat, you'll be depleted. So everyone needs to supplement. And that was sort of the rhetoric of it's not a plant-based diet thing, it's a everybody will be depleted thing. And it's just crazy
Right.
because it's the way he says it though is with so much conviction. And you just when you're listening to that, you believe it, which
Right.
it's
Right. But
I
he's wrong.
right. No,
Right.
we test people for B12, and I don't think I've ever seen a carnivore that has low B12. And if anything, there's people with excess B12 because maybe something's not properly working. But to the person that you were just talking about, Gardner, I mean, what does he say when he has those types of results when his B12 or in the recent study, the B12 dropped so much? How does he justify that in his study?
That's a good question. I mean, what he will say is, he will, I mean, to his credit, he measured it,
Yeah.
and he will say, so vegans, you can eat this, you need to supplement with B12. That's what, will come out of that study, but that is so far below the headlines of the study. The headlines of the study are, being vegan can protect against heart disease. That's only based on an LDL cholesterol measurement. I mean, as probably your audience knows, but if you measure 23 heart disease risk factors, as was done in the Verta trial, which was at University of Indiana, which went on for 2 years, they measured 23 cardiovascular risk factors, and 22 of those improved on a ketogenic diet, and one went the wrong way, and that was LDL cholesterol. So here's Christopher Gardner selecting the one that goes the wrong way, and it does so only transiently, is as the Verta study found out. After 2 years, it was normalized. So I think, I mean, there's clearly there's an agenda behind his science that's just so obvious. That in many, many ways, I mean, not just who funds him, who funded that experiment. It's all the, so the experiment was funded by an animal rights zealot whose wife runs an animal sanctuary in Sonoma County, California, and this whole center is underwritten by Beyond Meat. I mean, and he himself was a vegan before even starting doing research. And then he talks about, his whole center is devoted to advocating for the vegan diet. It's not even really a scientific center. It's an advocacy center where they're already trying to convince, they have programs to convince doctors, they have courses, they're trying to get all Stanford functions to be vegan by default. I mean, there's just this, like, they're an advocacy group, which, is fine, but they should not be in an academic center. They
Right.
shouldn't be in the Stanford Medical School. People going to that center should not be deluded into thinking that they're doing anything like scientific research, which requires a dispassionate approach. That's not what they're bringing to it. So, yeah, and the same is true at Harvard. I mean, I wrote a long piece about Walter Willett at Harvard, absolutely devoted vegetarian, if not vegan, for 30 years. Also funded by a bunch of food companies, but also very ideologically committed to vegetarian diet. And, and all their studies are come out for plant-based foods,
Right.
as you would expect. So I think there's so much bias in the science now. And yeah, I don't know how we got started on this, but I guess I understand, like, that I mean, it's normal and rational to trust Stanford and Harvard, but I would say in this case that they're really not doing what I would call science.
Yeah, my hope is that there was that one, I'm forgetting his name, but he was an editor of, I think it was some journal, and he ended up having all the moms walk and do that march to get Coke out of Coca-Cola. So I hope that one day we can do that. But you mentioned that the Verta article or the study, that there were other markers that were risk or improvements from a ketogenic diet for cardiovascular. I'm sure someone's going to wonder, if you remember some of the measures, what were some of the improvements from a low carb diet?
Yes, and I'm happy to give you the link for
Okay.
that paper. It's the cardiovascular outcomes for the Verta trial. And so, many measures of inflammation improve. It was basically everything they could think to measure. So CRP, other markers of inflammation, your HDL cholesterol goes up, which is good. Your triglycerides go down, also good. I think there was a subpanel, so LDL particle size that increased. So not the small dense LDL, which is considered, that's the one that's atherogenic. And, I don't know off the top of my head all the others, but it's really striking to see. They've got them all lined up and you see everything moving in the right direction. And then LDL just tends to go in the wrong direction. LDL, I mean, I think many people in your audience probably already know that, first of all, LDL, the rise has been shown to be transient. It's not related to the saturated fat content of the diet. That was a study recently published by David Ludwig out of Harvard. And LDL cholesterol, which is calculated, it's not actually measured. It's calculated from the other types of cholesterol that they actually directly measured. But in any case, LDL cholesterol is so poorly correlated with your heart disease risk. So roughly speaking, just as many people with high LDL get heart attacks as people with low LDL. And that's been replicated many, many times. The reason there's such an extraordinary focus on LDL cholesterol, as I wrote about in my book, I mean, statins are until the GLP-1 agonists, statins were the best selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. So, and statins lower your LDL. So there's a tremendous financial investment in focusing exclusively on LDL. Because also the pharmaceutical industry, they tried to create a drug that would raise your HDL cholesterol, right? That would be a positive thing for your cardiovascular risk, but they couldn't do it. They came up with drugs that turned out had toxic side effects. So they began a campaign, I believe, to try to discredit and minimize the importance of HDL and have all papers focus exclusively on LDL cholesterol, which is what the American Heart Association does, which is what expert reviews all tend to focus on LDL cholesterol. That's the investment of the pharmaceutical industry. It does not reflect reality because in the largest and longest observational studies, HDL cholesterol is far more tightly, which is to say highly correlated with your heart attack risk or your cardiovascular risk. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. And then what about, so I think a lot of the carnivores believe that in that I'm not worried if my cholesterol goes up, especially with the work of Dateman and that group. But in terms of saturated fat, I think when people do see like the LDL and they see an H or a high marker right next to their blood work, and then their doctor says you need to get on a statin right away, they start to get worried. And the question always is, well, why does saturated fats, or if they do, why do my markers go up a little bit? But what is it about the seed oils or canola or vegetable, soybean oil? Why are we using that over saturated fat? Is it really that the seed oils don't cause heart disease versus saturated fats?
Well, this is a big story, and it really is like it is the heart of the story of my book. And I don't want to go into it in too much detail and exhaust your listeners, but the original argument was that saturated fat causes heart disease,
Right.
and that was made by Ansel Keys from the University of Minnesota in the mid 1950s. Nobody knew what caused heart disease, and there were a number of plausible explanations, like it was vitamin deficiency or the rising tide of auto exhaust or the type A personality where you just run around screaming at everybody and then have a heart attack. I mean, these were seriously considered hypotheses in the mid 1950s, and sort of the key moment was when President Eisenhower had his heart attack in 1955. And so the whole nation is trained and focused on what causes heart disease. So into this debate or this vacuum about of knowledge of heart disease steps Ansel Keys. He says it's saturated fat and dietary cholesterol that cause heart disease. And his idea, he was so persuasive, so aggressive about his ideas. A little bit like you were talking about Michael Greger. I mean, really just super persuasive, would not stop talking until somebody was, he'd convinced them utterly. He was a very strong personality. He was able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association, such that in 1961, the American Heart Association issues the first guidelines anywhere in the world telling people to avoid saturated fat as the best way to prevent a heart attack. That was it. That was the beginning of this whole story, was that one American Heart Association guideline. So after that, I learned and discovered in my research that the American Heart Association had been accepting huge donations and was in fact kind of launched as a national organization by Procter and Gamble, maker of Crisco oil. Back in 1948, that had all begun, those relationships. And the president of the American Heart Association was found posing with a bottle of Crisco oil like he was some, advertising flack. So it's quite possible the American Heart Association had vegetable oil money behind it when it conveniently discovered that saturated fat was bad for health. But that's the story. It was give up saturated fat, which largely meant cutting back on regular fatty meat and switching over to low fat dairy, which didn't even exist at the time, like had to be created. Low fat milk and dairy free milk, not even to mention the soy and almond milks we now live with, and then replace it with vegetable oils. So that was like the huge boost given to vegetable oils, like Wesson oil, corn oil. They were even marketed for their cholesterol lowering powers. It was like, ask your doctor to tell you about vegetable oils like it was a medical prescription. And that was very intense in the 60s and the 70s. So why does trading out saturated fat for vegetable oils lower your first your total cholesterol and then it was your LDL cholesterol. That's because plant oils or vegetable oils, or more properly known as seed oils, they contain, what is it called? They contain, I think, phytosterols. If I'm not, I forget the word, but it actually replaces the cholesterol in your cell wall. So, which is not good for the cells because your cell walls need to be stable and fluid. And so, but these plant oils actually replaced cholesterol, and that's why they lower it, why it comes out lower in the readings when your doctor measures them. So they're just getting rid of the cholesterol in your body. But as anybody knows, cholesterol is a complex molecule. It's involved in so many hormonal reactions in your body. They're the foundation for many of your hormones, including sex hormones. Like, so we're not functioning properly as humans if we're not having adequate cholesterol or not producing enough cholesterol or trying to lower our cholesterol. One of the things that I found that was found in clinical trials was that the people who lowered their cholesterol, and these are large clinical trials, the people who lowered their cholesterol by lowering their saturated fat and replacing it with vegetable oils consistently died at higher rates from cancer. So that's clinical trial evidence, really the most rigorous kind of interventional level evidence that we have. And it shows that lowering cholesterol causes cancer. So I think, which is just to say, there's multiple side effects from giving up natural whole saturated fats. Saturated fats are the only fats that existed in cooking or eating before, really, until the 1900s. In the West, it was all butter and lard mainly, and then tallow and suet, and those were the fats that we cooked and we ate with. We cooked with and we ate. So really, we created this system where we called saturated fats bad and seed oils good. And the reality, as I discovered like in the course of my decade of research, is that it was just the reverse that was true. That we have really, really messed up our minds on what are good healthy fats and what are bad fats.
You mentioned the phytosterols for the replacement of some of the fat that's in our outer lining of each cell, but there's also other toxins in seed oils. Can you mention some of like what is so bad about seed oils if I had a little bit, every single day?
Well, there's the research that I did was that I discovered was the fact that seed oils they're very unstable molecules. I mean, they're called polyunsaturated fats, and the multiple part is the multiple double bonds they have. Okay, so if you remember your chemistry, double bonds are between atoms, and in conditions over time, or especially with heat and light, those double bonds open up and they each connect with oxygen. Okay, so what is oxygen? Is things are oxidized, and that drives inflammation. The reason that people take antioxidants is to get rid of all the oxidized particles. Those are created by seed oils, and to a lesser extent, foods that contain high amounts of seed oils. So that would be nuts and seeds are very high in them, but also chicken is higher in seed oils especially because of the way we raise it now. And depending on the pork can be fairly high in polyunsaturated fats. But vegetable oils have the highest concentration of these polyunsaturated fats. So especially when heated, they not only oxidize, but they then degrade into these called perioxidation products, is what they're called. They're kind of like, they're sort of, they're literally hundreds of these kind of spin-off molecules that are created when these polyunsaturated fats are heated. And these molecules, some of them are like polymers, like paint-like substances, and they're like shellacs. They've done in I mean, I could tell you stories that would horrify you, but they're highly so, and because they're unstable, they're reacting with everything. And when you eat a piece of fried chicken from a fast food place, there have been more than 200 of these perioxidation products that have been measured in a single piece of chicken. They are absorbed by your body. They pass through the brain body barrier. the brain-blood barrier. That has been shown. A lot of this work was done by this phenomenal researcher at the University of Minnesota, whom I interviewed, named Chelany. And one of those perioxidation products is called aldehydes, which is a known cause of cancer. So I think that the evidence from the clinical trials and also from this woman's work make seed oils a very likely cause of cancer. And then I think the other probable cause is for heart disease, just because of all these inflammatory process products and the fact that we know that inflammation drives heart disease. So I would say cancer and heart disease are likely health outcomes from having seed oils, fried food. There have been other people who have looked at seed oils. I mean, Chris Kenobi wrote a book about them. Dr. Kate Shanahan just has a book out, and they make claims that seed oils cause obesity and diabetes. I mean, according to Dr. Kenobi, they really cause every chronic condition. So I disagree with those assessments because I don't think the evidence is strong. But for cancer and heart disease, I think the evidence is substantial.
Yeah, I think so I looked into seed oils and how they process the whole thing, and they heat the product, I think more than 6 or 7 times, and the heat point of when these oils will turn. So this is just one other facet of why seed oils are so bad. But every time you heat it, it becomes more rancid, and it becomes, like you said, all of those peroxidase, it becomes oxidized, and it will steal all the electron and make everything inside your body more unstable, and then inflammation ensues. And inflammation is sort of modern days, why modern day illness exists. And so then they heat the oils while they're making it from some of the plants, I think 6 or 7 times. And then if we're using it in like the fried oils, I don't know how many times they're using that oil for how many days and such. And then if we heat it in the microwave, and so there's just so many times that we're heating these oils that become more and more rancid, and then that can then cause inflammation, and inflammation again can cause all the other illnesses. So I can see that, and I
Yeah.
and it just is unfortunate.
So I'm not aware that they, in the processing of the oils, say from the most common oil that we consume and that's used in all restaurants is from soybeans.
Okay.
That's the most commonly consumed one. There's also sunflower, safflower, corn oil, but really the cheapest and most commonly used one is soybeans. I don't know if they heat the oil multiple times when they're processing it, but certainly just having oils around a long time on your counter, they will slowly oxidize over time, right? And then if they're not in a dark container, but even just over time they'll oxidize. If you go and it's like if you eat a nut that has been sitting around for a long
Yeah.
time, you can taste that it's rancid. And then yeah, and then if you put it in a restaurant fryer, then it's that oxidation reaction, like we all know from chemistry class, oxidation speeds up wildly when you heat something. And ironically, and I talked to people who supply the oils for places like Burger King and McDonald's, and they said, ironically, those chains are much safer. I mean, I'm not saying any of this food is good to consume, but those chains, because of their liability awareness, because they're such, big targets, they have all kinds of mechanisms. They change the oil more regularly. They put something called nitrogen beads in the oil to absorb the oxidation products that are in there. They have a nitrogen blanket over the oil, which is imperceptible, but is there to try to prevent the oxidative products from spreading into the air. I mean, they take it very seriously. So paradoxically, they may be safer than like your average mom and pop or, a Chinese restaurant or something that's just frying up massive amounts of food in the back in the kitchen. So yeah, in general, I mean, it's really good to try if you go to, if you're eating out, to try to have things cooked in butter.
Yeah,
Like,
I think when I did the research, it was on canola and rapeseed plant specifically, and that's when they heat it like 6 to 7 times. But I didn't look
oh
into
yeah. Well,
soybeans, so that
canola,
makes
yeah,
sense.
canola is from rapeseed, so
Right.
that's a different, and I haven't, I don't know what their process is. I actually
Yeah.
went to a vegetable oil processing factory, so I like I knew, so I saw some of their product. I mean, it also goes through. it's an incredibly harsh process. Like when it first comes, when it's first pressed out of these beans or seeds, it's like a gray sludgy
Right.
substance. So they have to do what's called winterize it to make it more stable. And then they have to bleach it so that it's a nice color. And they do, and then they've taken out all the vitamins and out of it, so they have to put the vitamins back in. So I mean, it's a harsh and complicated industrial process to make these oils. And yeah, that's why, I mean, it's amazing that doctors and people, I think people are waking up to seed oils, because it's intuitive to understand that that's an industrial product and butter is not. So
Right.
I think people kind of understand that intuitively, but still, you will not find a medical expert in this country who will recommend, I mean, except for very, very few, who will recommend natural whole saturated fats over polyunsaturated vegetable oils. I mean, it's completely the reverse. And our dietary guidelines recommend 5.5 teaspoons of soybean oil every day. And that's what kids are getting fed in
Oh my
schools.
gosh.
That's what people are getting in hospital cafeterias. That's what our military gets. I mean, everybody is getting, well, that's for 2,000 calorie a day diet. So, but that's what people are being fed.
Oh, every time I look at the dietary guidelines, I look at the added sugar or what's allowed in schools, and I never thought about looking at what amount of fat and what source of fat. That just drives me crazy. You have tried to, I think for the 2020 dietary guidelines, you worked you worked so hard in trying to change some of the stuff that happened before the 2020 guidelines released. Can you share like how difficult is it to change the dietary guidelines, and what were you up against, and what was some of the stuff you saw?
Well, let's see. I mean, we tried really, really hard we targeted a couple of aspects. One was we tried to target the cap on saturated fat, which stands at 10% of calories and has for a very long time. We convened a group of experts to come to Washington and talk about saturated fats. They ended up on their own doing a landmark paper, which was in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. So that's like a very conservative journal. And that journal called it a state of the art review on saturated fats. It was fantastic. And it had among its authors 5 former members of the expert committees who had written the dietary guidelines in the past. So a really superb group of experts. And, saying like, we got it wrong, the evidence, we didn't look at this evidence or that evidence. And there are now, well, at the time, there were maybe 16 or 17 similar such papers, review papers by separate teams of scientists all over the world who had come to the same conclusion on saturated fats. We took all those papers and we had some of these former committee members visit the US Department of Agriculture, the US Department of Health and Human Services, which co-issue our dietary guidelines and run them. And basically, they had meetings, we had meetings in Congress, and they ended up ignoring all that evidence. Like none of that evidence was even considered. They wouldn't even accept it as something that they would look at.
Wow.
So that is crazy, I think, by any scientific standards. We also mobilized to try to get the committee, the experts, to consider the low carbohydrate diet as one of their dietary patterns. Currently there are 3 dietary patterns. They're all exactly the same, but have different, well, almost the same, but they have different names. So one is the US style diet, which is and then we have a Mediterranean style diet, but it's a Mediterranean diet with soybean oil. And they're basically the same. And then there's the vegetarian diet, which is just lower in meat, lower in protein, or no meat, I guess. And we said, why don't you look at the low carbohydrate diet as an additional dietary pattern for people with metabolic diseases? So there are these various these public comment periods. We swamped the comment period. Like our people, we had thousands of comments. The USDA acknowledged that they received more comments on low carb than any other topic. And they did review the low carb diet, but they didn't find any studies on it. They said, including one of the members of the committee had done a study, but they couldn't find that study because they had impossible search criteria or something. So they said we just don't have any data on it. And now they're not reviewing low carb diets at all. And they're not looking at any of the clinical trial data. I mean, when they said they couldn't find any data on the low carb diet, at that point, there were probably 200 clinical trials on the low carbohydrate diet. And now there are many, many more. And yeah, so I mean, in the end, I thought, well, we have, as I said in the beginning, we have accomplished something for the dietary guidelines that I can talk about a little bit later. But I realized that, mobilizing people, trying to do the citizens thing, like, we would probably need many, many millions of dollars to basically, buy off politicians, or, we just would need more money behind us to be successful, because we had people calling their senators and congressmen. We had people visiting. There was a lot that went on just to try to bring some science to the guidelines that had been ignored, and we were not successful.
I did see there was like 2 grams, or there was like a couple grams less of added sugar that they knocked off. So I thought that's a little bit of a win for 2020. Um,
Yeah, didn't notice that. I mean, it's still true that you can have up to 10% of your calories as sugar. It's
right,
still true that you're supposed to have 6 servings of grains a day, including 3 servings of refined grains. How crazy is that?
crazy.
And I mean, not that whole grains are any better for you. So, and in schools, there is no cap on sugar.
Right.
Like, there's currently unlimited amounts of sugar in school meals.
And I saw somewhere that ketchup can be considered a fruit or vegetable just from a financial reason. It's just unfortunate because I know our community can say, well, I don't follow those guidelines, so I don't care. But it actually does matter because it affects the hospitals, the jails, the schools, and all of these places where government supports food. And that's where our children, especially if they go to public school, will absolutely be eating this. And this is our next generation. And it's so concerning because I had Callie Means on not too long ago, and he talked about how the big food, big pharma, they love having somebody that's 18 and diabetic because they'll be plugged into the system forever, and the big pharma gets paid for the 50 years they're alive, and all the medical complications they get covered through Medicare or whatever the government assistance is for these really sick people, and all because they're following the dietary guidelines, which is insane.
Right. Right. No, I mean, I think that it also affects our poor people are
Right.
served. They literally, in some states, you can get Dora the Explorer cereal and sugary wheat checks as part of. There's no meat in those food baskets. There's like maybe a dozen eggs. It's the kind of food that really sets young people on a path to be really sick, overweight, mentally impaired. I mean, and those are the people that then we as citizens need to have to support as they're
Right.
unwell and they go forward. And then our military, I don't know if
Oh yeah,
um,
yeah, that's right.
Casey talked about that, but our military has an obesity problem that is equal to the one that we have at the general population, which is to say over 70% of their population is obese or overweight. And so we have missed our recruiting targets for 3 years running. And they have terrible problem because they have so many. The main source of not having enough active troops for those who are enrolled is that they suffer from all kinds of fractures and injuries and problems that result from being overweight. Doing exercise while you're overweight makes you more likely to be injured. So, I mean, it affects us in so many ways. I think something like 89% of our healthcare budget is devoted to treating chronic diseases.
Right.
So, we're all paying for it, unfortunately. Yeah, we all are. And the dietary guidelines, just for people to understand, like, it's a federal policy. It's required by law that all federal programs follow those guidelines.
Right.
And so, like, there's no choice. And that's why it's so important that they change, even though I myself will say it's it's like trying to shift the Titanic. I mean, it's an incredible struggle and really difficult. And nobody has tried harder than I have. But I think, ultimately it does have to change in order for our nation to be able to get better.
So what can we do as individual citizens to start, supporting a movement other than what the dietary guidelines are sharing?
Well, I think it's just like we talked about before. I mean, unfortunately, like I'm no longer in that advocacy role. So I think it's going to be somebody else stepping in to take over the work that I did, or Ken Berry's nutrition, his American Diabetes Society, or it's going to be something else. And somebody's going to have to step into those shoes. And if any of your listeners or followers want to contact me, feel free. There's there's a lot to do,
Right.
and I can't be I did it for a number of years, and now I really want to be writing, and I want to write another book. And but I think, for people who are like where this is what they want to do, there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Yeah, I think we all have to do our part, be healthy, as you mentioned earlier on in the podcast episode. And in our practice, we have a lot of blood work at this point of low carb dieters. And so, as I was telling you offline, we are trying to do a comparison of here's an illness, here's how the blood work looks of a person that's ill that ate carnivore versus we have another practice we can compare data with that eats a standard American diet. And many of the markers we are trying to compare is inflammatory markers. So we are working on that behind the scenes to try to publish that as a, like a bigger than a just a simple case study, but just to do data of like this is statistically significant that even if you're ill with this, a carnivore diet can reduce inflammation. And here's the markers that show that.
Yeah,
So
well,
our
that's fantastic. I mean, so there are various prongs in trying to move the science forward, right? One of them is getting more data, having more published data, having data in new topics and new ways. Certainly on carnivore, there's just a desperate need for more data on how well it works, right? I mean, it's astonishing the health conditions that are being helped by this way of eating. Like I still can hardly believe it myself, but I think, and that needs to be published.
right.
Even case series, like thing just to like show, look, it's safe, and it's really performing almost like miracles. I mean, things that you just don't even see in modern science. So moving the data forward is important. I would also argue that, and moving the policy, and I think that there are many things in policy right now for which we don't need any more data. Like we could, I mean, saying we, the government could eliminate its caps on saturated fats.
Right.
It could recommend a low carbohydrate diet for virtually all metabolic conditions. And those are currently evidence-based
Right.
decisions. And there's more evidence for a low carbohydrate approach than there is for any of the existing dietary patterns that they are currently recommending. So, one of the criticisms you hear is like, oh, there's not enough evidence, you don't have long-term evidence, you don't have this. Well, the current government recommendations are not supported by anywhere near the evidence that we have for the low carbohydrate diet. Or, so really those kinds of complaints are not justified. So we need to do more research, more policy, and I think there's a lot to be done. And obviously this is what I've now chosen to do, but in terms of just informing people, trying to get articles out there, trying to do, get this message more out there and out beyond our community to the mainstream to be heard more, really to just raise awareness.
Well, if there's anyone that could write the article, it is you to have written the
Thanks.
carnivore diet for women and representing us. So thank you so much for doing that. Where can people find your Substack? Where can people follow you? I think you mentioned Twitter, but if you have any other accounts, and what is the URL?
Yeah, so really the only account I'm active on is, I mean, I post on LinkedIn and Facebook under my name, but I am Big Fat Surprise on Twitter, and that's kind of where I'm mostly active. And then if you want to sign up for the newsletter, I mean, you can sign up for free and try it. It's on a platform called Substack, and our newsletter is called Unsettled Science. So, and even if you just search my name, well, I mean, even if you just search Big Fat Surprise and Nina, you'll find it. So that's where I'm doing most of my work right now.
Yeah, I love it. I have subscribed, and I love the content you share and the almost the fact checking that you do. I love that, and it's just it provokes thinking, and I absolutely think it's a highly recommend reading, and it's a continuation of my the Big Fat Surprise. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you do and all the attention that you bring to what really matters, especially for health and wellness. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on, Judy. And it's really great to talk to you. And thank you for everything you're doing to help people get healthy. So I
Well, thank
appreciate
you.
that too.
Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you haven't read Nina's first book, The Big Fat Surprise, it's a highly recommended book to read because it shares all the studies, the history of why saturated fat was demonized, and all the different studies that are not super strong in the arguments for seed oils or vegetable oils, and how a lot of the information has been very biased. You'll understand why it's okay to eat saturated fats and it actually is really beneficial for you. In continuation from that book, since it's been written about 10 years ago, you will want to consider her Substack as she shares a lot more of the current events that go on in the dietary space. If you read the Tufts Food Compass, she talks about that. A lot of the different studies and nutritional updates that come along, she addresses them and she always cites her information. And it's just written in a way that makes you think, and she tries not to be super biased. I think it is such a great read. So if you haven't checked out her Substack, I highly recommend it. Okay, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you later. Bye, guys.